Morning, everybody. Sabah khair, boker tov. Thank God I'm still here. Although my son, who was studying martial arts, can tell me everything I did wrong. So my, the day after this happened, this was a Friday, and we have a tradition in the Jewish tradition when you've been through a dangerous experience to do what we call Birkat HaGomel, the blessing for having been saved from a life-threatening situation. And you are called to the Torah. The Torah portion in our Jewish weekly cycle of Torah portions for that Shabbat was Lech Lecha, where among other things we read the story of the conflict between Abraham and Lot, Abram still at the time, and there was enough room for all the shepherds, and Abram, of course, is the senior, Lot is his nephew, and he can certainly tell Lot, this is the way it's going to be. But rather than that, he bends over backwards. He says, there's enough room for all of us, and what's most important is that we are family. You want to go left, I'll go right. You want to go right, I'll go left. I often think, and that's why I asked that I have that aliyah, that call to the Torah, to say the Birkat HaGomel, that we, the children of Abraham, who struggle so mightily to claim the physical inheritance that he's bequeathed to us of the land, if we would spend one iota spending the same kind of energy to be worthy of the moral inheritance that he tied to bequeath to us, we would all be in a much better place. I'm in a rather difficult position this morning because I've been asked to explain some of the ideas within the Jewish tradition which are so different than mine. But that's perhaps an important place to start. I think it's true also for Christianity, for Islam, for many other faith traditions, but certainly if we're talking about Judaism, a big red warning light should go off in your head if anybody ever says, Judaism says. Our religion is simply too ancient, too multi-layered, too based on debate to say that about almost anything. And as much as I would love to say, I have the true understanding of our Jewish faith and our texts and our tradition, I know I can't say that. That those who think very differently than I do also have texts from the Bible, texts from our ongoing Jewish tradition that they can point to justify the positions that they take. But I think that there is also a real lesson here. Any of us, or so many of us, let's say, try to hide behind our faith traditions. Well, I wouldn't really do it this way, but I don't have any choice. This is what God says. This is what the Bible says. This is what my holy texts say. The Quran says. And forgetting that all of us, certainly, at least limiting myself to Judaism, I'll certainly say in our Jewish tradition, there is no such thing as the truth that we automatically, the plain truth that is clear from the Bible or from any other textual tradition. There's always a mixture between who we are, what we read from the text, and what we read into the text. That's human nature. So, for example, even in this week's Torah portion in our Jewish tradition, we are toward the end of the book of Exodus. We are reading about the construction of the tabernacle. And of course, we are, apropos to what we just heard in the previous teaching, Bezalel, who is the chief architect and artisan of the tabernacle. It says that he had chokhmat lev. He didn't just have intelligence or artistic ability, he had wisdom of the heart. And in the Jerusalem Talmud, we are taught that they're confused because, we had all the exact directions that God gives to Moses about how the tabernacle is supposed to be built, and then we have almost the same repetition of how it's actually done, but there's some differences. Bezalel did some things he wasn't told to do. And the Talmud says, because when we use also and as dangerous as this is, perhaps, but when we use our human intuition from the wisdom of the heart, that then we can also be doing God's will. And of course, there's a danger there, because then how do we know what is God's will, and how do we know what's coming from what we would like to think is God's will? The Talmud goes on to bring another example, that how Joshua defied what he was given, what he was told by Moses when he was to carry on, told to wipe out everybody in the land of Canaan. And there were, of course, some very violent incidents, but at some point Joshua stops. And the Talmud says that's a positive example. And the Midrash is even more radical. The Midrash, which is an ancient form of rabbinic commentary on the Bible, says that it goes through the list of the things that God commanded Moses, and Moses did something different, and God said retroactively, you were right. One of them is when he's commanded to attack and wipe out peoples, and Moses instead, to the Midianites, for example, offers peace first. The Midrash, the rabbis even said that sometimes Moses was right in defying a direct order of God. And in this case, for the sake of peace, the ultimate blessing, that we finish our main Amidah prayer, our central Jewish prayer, we pray 3 times a day, or at least, with the prayer for peace. And if we look, for example, in the Talmud in Bava Kama, we see that then later we also have this tradition that where later Jewish scholars turned on their heads by the rabbis of the Talmud. And just for time's sake, I won't get into that. But the point is that we all have a responsibility, of course, to try to answer God's call, to understand God's call, to understand our holy texts, but with great self-awareness of how we as human beings bring ourselves into these texts. So what is, when I look at the basis for, and of course it's very sad and painful for me as a rabbi, as a Jew, as an Israeli, as a Zionist, that there are many Israelis who agree with many of the things that I believe in, which of course start with, if we recognize that God's image in every human being, that means recognizing the human rights of every human being, be they Jewish or Palestinian or African asylum seekers or anybody else. So it's painful for me that although there are many Israelis who support and believe in many of the things that we do, most of them are secular. And statistically, the religious population among Israeli Jews is much more likely to be racist and opposed to human rights. Not across the board, of course, but statistically a much greater chance. So if we look, I think we also have to understand that what today is called kind of religious nationalism really is a combination of religion and nationalism. Sometimes a very problematic combination. And it starts from the fact that we as Jews are a scarred people. 2,000 years of oppression because we were stateless and homeless. That leaves a mark on our souls. And it leaves, of course we were taught in Exodus, chapter 23, also again chapter 22, again and again. Because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, You have a special obligation to be different. Remember that you know what it's like, but that's difficult. And we also know what the psychologists teach us, that those who were beaten as children are much more likely to beat their own children. And we are a scarred people. And then let's look at the Bible. You cannot look and read the Bible, literally at least, without understanding that God promises the land of Israel to the Jewish people in perpetuity. Remember that in our tradition, there's been no abrogation of the covenant. The covenant, as far as we're concerned, with the Jewish people is still ongoing. And that means that we have the land is the ot habrit. It is the sign of the covenant between us and and God. And you know, in 1967, my wife remembers huddling in a bomb shelter. And many around her while her father was off fighting somewhere, and convinced that this was the end, that Israel was going to be wiped out. I mean, we can look at revisionist history and understand maybe that wasn't really such a danger, but that's the way people felt. And when that did not happen, but in fact, we won this, what seemingly was miraculous victory, there were a few lone voices in the wilderness, such as Yeshayahu Leibovich, and even our first prime minister, no longer in power, but David Ben-Gurion, who were warning that this could be a moral disaster. But this seemed, if we say in our prayers that the creation of the state of Israel for us, and we know for others it's Nakba, but for us it's Rishit Smichat Gulatenu, it's the beginning of our redemption, then this victory seemed like God's hand in history. Instead of being defeated, we were now in control of more or less the entire biblical land of Israel. And according, that released powerful, seductive, messianic passions, saying that it would be sinful, now that God has given us this gift, to return land, to go in that direction. My answer, and I should also say that Rabbis for Human Rights has no position on a 1 or a 2 or a 10-state solution or borders here or there or anywhere else. That's beyond our mandate to deal with human rights. Is that if you look at that same Bible, and certainly the prophets, yes, we are promised that God has given us this land in perpetuity, but we're also taught that the amount of land that we will control at any given point in time will expand or contract according to our moral behavior. We can debate now what moral behavior is. But if we believe that oppressing another people is not moral behavior, then maybe there's an irony here. That the very things that we would need to do to hold on to this land are the things that make us, in God's eyes, unworthy to hold on to it at this point in time. And as Joshua learned eventually, and as so many other people have said, yes, the land is holy in our belief, but as the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel would say so often, as iconoclastic as Judaism is against images of God, creating any images of God, there is an image of God in this world. He said it, for example, in Chicago at a conference on racism. And that image of God is the human being. And in the hierarchy of values, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the founder of the Orthodox Shas movement, said, yes, it would be painful to give up any land, but he said that most of his followers would rather forget. But if you can prevent bloodshed, Human life is more holy even than the land. So now we have this land in our hands. And of course, it requires measures and violence even to hold on to it. And therefore, we've raised up, that not all settlers are violent fanatics. Some of them are. What's sad is that was, the person who's been indicted, although not yet convicted, is only 17 years old. And I wanted to cry when the same way I want to cry when I hear about a 13-year-old Palestinian taking up a knife and asking who is cultivating this kind of hate, this kind of use of violence. And of course, again, that's that issue that we all see ourselves as the victims. For all the ways we can't talk about anything parallel between Israelis and Palestinians when we Israelis have so much more political, economic, and military power, we're incredibly symmetrical, and we all see ourselves as the victims. Say to any Israeli or Palestinian, you are a victimizer, and they will be furious, outraged. How dare you say I'm the victimizer? I'm the victim. A late 19th, early 20th century Rabbi Tamarat taught that the reason why the children of Israel had to stay in their homes when the angel of death passed over Egypt was because even when your cause is just, any corruption with violence corrupts, and the difference between being a victim and a victimizer is less than a hairbreadth, and sometimes you can be both at the same time. But remember now that we have raised in the occupied territories a generation of young people who know nothing else. A friend of mine in Jerusalem, she was having a conflict with her neighbor over their garden. And the police and everyone said, my friend was right. This woman's daughter was a settler from Hebron and came in and said, Mom, let me show you how it's done. You don't listen to the police. This is the way you just make sure that you keep this garden. And so we have a generation today who even thinks that their parents, who founded the settlements, are Uncle Toms and Quislings. Mom, and so this is the way you just make sure that you keep this garden. There are only a handful of people. I'm carrying myself back. That's scary. Did I really say that? But we've created a generation of people, the so-called hilltop youth, and again, I emphasize again, there's a handful relatively of these people, several tens perhaps all, who are willing to do these violent acts of what we call the price tag operations, the murders in Duma, the burning of mosques, and all these kinds of activities. And then there's the next circle of those who maybe wouldn't do those acts, but they support them. And even the larger circle of people that we're against it, but we prefer to turn away and not recognize what's happening. And that is really the basis, I think, starting from the religious basis that this land is ours, the belief that we are the victims, and therefore the solution to our victimhood is the use of power and even violence, and the corrupting influence of having lived with not only individual violence. And as I wrote after my attack, I said, it's praiseworthy that unlike, even today, as we see the latest round of violence, and we don't see, I'll be honest, enough Palestinian leaders condemning Palestinian violence. And in that sense, it's praiseworthy that all of our leaders, from Netanyahu on down, condemn the Duma murders and these kinds of things. However, what they condemn is individuals taking the law into their own hands and using violence. At the same time as some of these same leaders are employing state violence. And of course, the message then, even to the individuals, is, well, if this is the way the state operates, then why can't I do the same? I want to conclude simply, first of all, from my point of view, Judaism is not a pacifist religion. We believe that we have the right and responsibility to defend ourselves. Some of these violent settlers also believe that this is the only way to defend themselves, that they have to show that they can use violence to prevent violence against them, as sick as an idea as that is. We're taught in the Jewish tradition that it is gnai, it is a disgrace to have a sword or a weapon on you on our Sabbath. It's so antithetical to what we believe in. And yet, every single Israeli school child can teach you, can repeat what we're taught in the Talmud. If someone's coming to kill you, you get up earlier and you kill them first. But then I ask them how it continues, and they don't know. So we're taught about the rodef. Someone's chasing after somebody with a knife to murder them. You must kill the pursuer, not only to save the person being pursued, but to save the pursuer from him or herself, from committing such a terrible crime. But we're taught, if you could have stopped that person by any other means, you could have shouted, shot them in the foot. You could have started a peace process. And you kill that person, the Talmud says you yourself are guilty of murder. Violence is not to self-defense, but not minimum necessary force. And then the stakes get even higher. On the same page of Talmud, we're taught, someone comes to Rabbah, one of the same rabbis that a few pages earlier said, if someone's coming to kill you, you can go up there and kill them first. But now the question is, the strong man in my village is going to come kill me if I don't go kill this innocent third person. What should I do? Rabbah would have had no problem had the answer been to defend yourself against the person coming to attack you. But regarding that innocent third person, he says, let yourself be killed rather than killed. Who's to say that your blood is redder than his? That's a high standard to live in by. Our founder, Rabbi David Foreman, was a soldier in the First Lebanon War. One day, his commander said, look over there. There are Palestinians. They're pointing RPGs at us, but they're holding a civilian in front of them. We're not going to shoot. They didn't shoot, and 2 of his army buddies were killed. To the day he died, he said, I don't know if I did the right thing or not. How could I have shot and killed an innocent people? And how can I look at the widows in their eyes and say, your husband's dead because we didn't shoot? And of course, once those are your options, you're in a lose-lose situation. And that's why, again, we have to think about getting out of the box and finding ways of ending the occupation, of getting to a situation where we aren't in those kinds of lose-lose situations. And finally, there's a well-known saying in the Jewish tradition in Pirkei Avot, who is truly mighty? The one who controls his or her desires and passions. But there's a second Pirkei Avot, the Rabbi Natan, and it says, who's even the mighty of the mighty? And that's the person who can turn an enemy into a friend. And so, yes, we do live in a complex reality. We, Israelis, do face people who would still like to kill us, to throw us into the sea. I don't think the answer is by responding with violence, although we have to have enough capability of defending ourselves. But getting out of the box, turning the enemy into the friend, in an active way, that is our challenge, so that we not be caught up eternally in this ongoing cycle after cycle after cycle of violence. Thank you. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Thank you, Rabbi Arik. I had the honor last year of being with Rabbi Arik Ascherman, where both of us were honored with a doctoral of divinity degree from the Chicago Theological Seminary. And it was a joy and an honor to be with you at that time. I'm gonna push you a little bit now.
Go for it. Go for it.
Because part of what we are studying in this conference is radicalism in religion. And to study the biblical, Quranic, religious texts that enforce the mindset of the radical. So in the video that we saw a young Jewish settler attacking you as a fellow Jew, probably knew you were a rabbi from the organization that you presented. And we could talk about land, we could talk about he feels ownership, he feels threatened, which I don't think he was threatened by you. But there is a basis of religious text and ideology that he is using, he has been taught to even attack you as a fellow Jew, let alone attack a Palestinian. And I want us to learn, like if you put yourself in that young man's shoes, what did he learn? What did he study that made him see you as a traitor and continues to see me as an enemy?
Got me. I don't see anything in our tradition that teaches us to use that kind of violence. I can tell you, though, that as incredible as it seems to all of us, he felt threatened. And when he was released to house arrest, very irresponsibly as far as I'm concerned, one of our major Israeli television outlets interviewed him, and he said, we've got these leftists that are endangering us. They're leading the Palestinians to come, storm our gates. And he apparently was a personal friend of one of the members of the Fogel family. He's from Itamar, where the Fogel family was murdered. He does feel personally threatened at some level, as incredible, and that's an important lesson because the world sees us as one of the powerful states in the world, and these incredibly successful Jewish communities around the world, and inside, we feel threatened, and we have to understand that. We have to find a way of moving beyond that, of course, but we have to understand that's not just made up. And there's another thing I would say. Another midrash says, don't delude yourself. The hand that strikes the non-Jew will eventually strike the Jew as well. Not as if striking the non-Jew is okay. But the idea is violence begets violence, and I don't think it's necessarily text. I think it's this combination of text and nationalism. There are, among the most radical settlers, those who believe that we have to force God's hand in history. If we were to build, take down, if we were to, build a new temple on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, and that would create a worldwide jihad, then God would have to come and save us. We would force God's hand. But other than this very deep belief that it's ours and God has promised us and we have to redeem the land by any means possible, and that somehow those of us who disagree are a threat to that, I cannot think of any text in Jewish tradition that justifies that kind of violence.
Thank you. Another question that I had was, you said that, and then this is Jewish belief, that the land was given to the Jewish people in perpetuity.
Yes.
And for me, as a Palestinian, as a Christian who lives in this land, what would you say God's will is for me?
Okay. So, that's an interesting question. Because, first of all, again, I can't say that all the Jewish authorities over the years, but the majority said that, there are those who say the only good, people in the Talmud also say the only good non-Jew is a dead non-Jew. There are those who say that there can be no rights or ownership of anything in the land of Israel by anybody other than Jews. But actually the vast majority of our authorities say that to steal from a non-Jew, even in the land of Israel, is theft, pure and simple. And it's wrong. And so it gets back again to arguing in our tradition. And here, I will bring up this Talmudic passage in Baba Kama. It basically says, if the famous goring ox, if the ox of the non-Jew gores the ox of the Jew, the penalty is much greater than if it's the other way around. And then even then the next generation of rabbis in the second half of the Talmud were disturbed by this, but they found an excuse. They said it's because all these people were pagans and didn't even accept the basic kind of Noahide laws, the things that we expect of everybody, and therefore everything they own is like ownerless. And then much later, a Jewish scholar by the name of Meiri, in the mid-ages, said, but the religions around us, that's not the way it is anymore. Mm-hmm. So according to the own Talmudic logic, we have to change that. And discrimination after discrimination after discrimination against non-Jews, he turned on its head on that basis. And so that's my point again, is we can just take it all as given. The Talmud says, the Bible says, and therefore this is what I have to do. Or we can, Amiri doesn't say, I reject the Talmud or the Bible, or I reject Judaism. But from within, he does, even what the Talmud says that Bezalel does, he finds the wisdom of the heart and the courage to struggle from within for the soul of our own religion.
Thank you. One last question.
Sure.
The concept of chosenness.
Yes.
I think many of us are challenged with this understanding of the chosen people, and that there is a special, the concept of chosenness. I think there's a big challenge for many of us with this concept of chosenness, the special people, the chosen ones, and how that plays out within Jewish discourse. That it's an exclusive, unique aspect, ethnic-centered aspect for a certain group of people that are elevated above all of us and everybody else. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges here that we face, is that by this chosenness and by having certain churches in the US acknowledge this chosenness in a certain way with financial, political, economic, military support, part of it being linked with fear. If we don't bless, we will be cursed. All of these notions, how do you respond to this concept of the exclusivity of a people in the eyes of God compared to everybody else?
So that is, I'm going to be very unpolitic here and simply say, to me, the idea that God loves any group more than others is ridiculous. I admit that I feel the same way when I hear, some of the, church triumphalism. I feel the same way. I think every people, with God on our side, it's like, God is ours. I think that, and maybe that's one of the reasons why in ancient history, if you were defeated in battle by somebody else, you said, well, their God must be stronger, we'll adopt that God. Whereas, Judaism said, no, there's one God of the entire universe, and God, if something bad happens to us, that's part of God's will as well. Many Jewish scholars and authorities have struggled with the issue of chosenness. There are movements within Judaism, such as Reconstructionism, that have eliminated it, saying it's just. My personal feeling is, the Bible says very clearly, you're not better than anybody else. You've been chosen for responsibility. And there's a midrash that says that God chose every people in the world for something. Our job is to bring Torah to the world. The Greeks were supposed to bring philosophy to the world. The Romans, architecture. And, by that kind of logic, also Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and every other group would all have their place in God's world and their function and their responsibilities. And so I would just simply say to my fellow Jews, rather than patting ourselves on the back because we're better, or saying we're chosen to suffer, or something like this, let's talk about, have we fulfilled our responsibility to bring a vision to the world of what the world might be like if we just would only do what we learned from the very first chapters of the book of Genesis, understanding that above all of us as human beings, there is God, and therefore we are not free to rape the earth, to kill, to do whatever we want, as if we are the pinnacle of all existence, and understanding that every human being is created in God's image. As we in chapter 1, verse 27, it doesn't say just Jews. It doesn't say just the wealthy. It makes a point of saying both men and women. That's where I think we should be focusing, is how we fulfill our responsibilities, and that's what chosenness is about.
Thank you.
Okay.